What do you think is like the first piece to drop?
Well, Chinese history is rich with examples of how it all falls apart in a short period of time. If I were a betting man, I think that the two most vulnerable parts of the international system right now are energy transport and food production. About 80% of the calories that humans produce are produced with at least one imported input, whether it's pesticide, fertilizer, fuel, tractors, whatever. And with the Chinese, it's more like 90%.
90% is imported.
Yeah. Well, no, not their food is imported. The inputs.
The inputs.
The input strain. And 90% of the calories they produce are dependent upon a foreign support system. In the United States, it's less than 10. We produce most of what we need locally, and most of the rest comes from Canada. But you interrupt the food supply chain in any meaningful way, and China is only one of a host of countries that has some very real problems. Now, China faces the biggest one in absolute terms because of the size of their population. But with the Russians having their problems, the Russian space is the world's largest single supplier of fertilizer of all types. So we are already knee-deep in a fertilizer crisis globally. And we're seeing industrial accidents in the Russian space that are so big you can see them from orbit because, a lot of petroleum stuff explodes if it doesn't go right. And the Russian facility has been held together with duct tape and Western tech for a while now. That's all gone now. So China, being kind of the last man in line to get a lot of this stuff, is in a very vulnerable position. We're probably going to see about 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude fall offline within the next few weeks as part of the price cap that the Europeans are putting into place. But more important, all the insurance firms have said they're not going to deal with Russia anymore. So you're not supposed to sail at all with your ship if you don't have an insurance policy. So countries like China and India are stepping in and offering sovereign indemnifications, but that's something they've never done before. And so if there's ever a case where a ship, for whatever reason, needs to file a claim, it's going to immediately go to international arbitration because they have no method for the payout. As soon as that happens, no one's going to take an Indian insurance policy again. That's another 1 million to 2 million barrels a day that goes offline. And then all the crude that the Chinese get from eastern Siberia is from fields that the Russians never developed themselves. That was all BP. BP's gone. So we don't know how long the Russians can keep it operating, but we know it's going to go to zero. We just don't know how long it's going to take. And the Chinese are the last in line for all of this stuff. And if you have a food or an energy crisis, or God forbid, both at the same time, on top of a health crisis, on top of government incompetence, there is no way a central government holds together in that sort of environment. Now, like I said, Chinese history is rich with ways that can all fall apart. Oftentimes it's based on having this hyper-centralization and an incompetent leader, or an incompetent leader cadre maybe is a better way to phrase that. But how it usually goes is that the North kind of falls in on itself. It falls into famine. It falls into tyranny. You get hundreds of millions of people suffering from malnutrition and then ultimately dying. The coast goes one way, the interior kind of breaks off and shatters. And then the cities of the coast in the south, your Shanghai, your Fujian, your Guangzhou, your Hong Kong, they basically become independent city-states and integrate with foreign powers primarily in order to get food. And if you look back at the last 14 centuries, for almost that entire period until 1945, the city-states have been dependent upon foreigners to keep themselves alive. So we're really just reverting to a historical mean here.
Now, one of the things that's really disturbing to the West is watching what's happened to Hong Kong.
Sure.
That Hong Kong has essentially been taken over by the CCP, and they've imposed their rule of law on people that had existed in more or less a westernized democracy.
Right.
Like, how do they control that?
The Chinese?
Yeah, I mean...
Well, Hong Kong would probably be one of those cities that splits off. But for that to happen, you first have to have the northern section basically fall in on itself. As long as there are security services, these southern cities can't go their own way. But as soon as something happens to those security services and they're focused on the homeland in the north, then the southern cities are going to bolt.
Now, what does China think about? Did they have an understanding of this collapse, or is it just because of Xi's power over everyone that none of this gets discussed, so there's no planning?
This is one of the beautiful things about authoritarianism is they start telling stories and eventually they believe them. It happened in Russia. It's happening in China. Chinese academics as recently as 10 years ago were very, very aware of this, and it shaped government policy. They wanted to make sure that the Democrats, little d, in Hong Kong didn't get too uppity. They tried to make sure that there were people from the South on the Politburo. But as we've gotten into a more ossified and centralized decision-making system, all of the lessons of the past are going away, and it's all about central control. And they're, once again, because this is another trend that pops up in China over and over again, they're forgetting their own history.
But China has always been thought of as a country, at least the narrative has always been that they plan long game.
Yeah, that's a bunch of crap.
Is it?
Yeah, no, the Chinese are just as bad as everyone when it comes to ideological blinders and short-term decision-making. And the more isolated and concentrated the the tools of power become, the more problematic that becomes.
So what is their plan on getting through what you think is a 10-year timeline for their demise?
Beat the nationalist drum so that when the food and the energy run out, everyone is banding together simply because they're Han Chinese.
That's it?
That's as good as it's going to get because there is no trade option out of this without the United States.
What do you think the world looks like in 10 years?
I think we'll have a system of regional trade where you've got certain regional powers who have actually benefit from the environment. So one of the fun things about the United States is that we've got more navigable waterways than everyone else in the world put together, about 13,000 miles. And it's about 1/10 the cost to move things by water as it is to move it by truck. So with that sort of environment and ocean moats, the United States is an economic power, whoever who is in charge. I mean, we've had decades of bipartisan effort to try to screw this up, and we haven't pulled it off yet. We're not going to do it under Biden. He doesn't have the energy. Which means that globalization from our point of view, from an economic point of view, was a problem because we had one of the world's best geographies. And we deliberately sublimated that in order to support our allies against the Soviets in the Cold War. We basically paid people with globalization to be on our side. And it worked. But we're getting away from that. And now geography is going to have a much bigger role to play. And if you layer demographics on top of that, if you have a country with a decent geography and a decent demography, they can kind of write their own ticket in the world we're going to. And there are a few of those. The United States is at the top of the list. Argentina looks really good. France and Turkey look great. And then Japan is kind of a consolation prize because they've managed to cut a deal with both the American right and the American left and get themselves invited into kind of an American friends and family plan. So you get these spheres of influence that don't necessarily cooperate or compete with one another, but are kind of in their own little worlds.